We've talked a lot about the analytic discourse over the past 5 or 6 lecture series. It remains the clinical and conceptual centerpiece at the start of Seminar 20, and thus for our series as well. But what about discourse itself, analytic or otherwise? You've often heard me define discourse as a structure, an algorithmic structure, even an algebraic structure, in which certain impasses can be written. In other words, you've heard me define discourse as a matheme. Discourse for Lacan is the original matheme. So let's sit down and take a look at this matheme once more. The blackboard in front of you, for those of you watching, is the one on which I'm going to draw it one more time. If you are just listening, this may be again an opportunity to pause and go to a video feed instead, because we are going to be doing some diagrammatic work in this lecture, and it may be something you want to see if you can't hear it with your mind's eyes. So the basic structure of Lacan's theory of discourse at this point in his thought is this animal. He used to call it a 4-footed animal. I'll ask you now how many feet it has. Comprised of an agent addressing someone else, an adressive structure which yields certain products, and all at the behest of a certain truth. Now, what we've also seen from Lacan recently is the addition of this 5th vector that returns from truth to other. I draw the middle vectors in yellow just to give you a contrast there. And of course, what we've been seeing even more recently than this is what indeed happens between truth and product in this previously known field known as a delta of impotence. Here now we see raised to the status of an impossibility, you've heard me say. And here I'm just riffing on the report that Lacan offers on Seminar 19, which we discussed in our last series. So here is this matheme, this discourse that is a matheme. You see an agent addressing another atop a foundation of cause and effect, truth and product. And it is a foundation that is cracked and fissured by feelings of powerlessness that have been raised to the level of impossibility. The same level where Lacan tells us we incarnate the real. That's what you see in the green delta or the green triangle between truth and product. This is the site of a fissured feeling of powerlessness that, in Lacan's thought, now is raised to the level of an impossibility. It's here in this green delta, if we can even figure it as a space, that we see the real incarnate. Between these two lower elements of cause and effect, truth and product, in any given discourse, what I'm telling you is that there is something real, this real incarnate, and it's always incarnated as an impasse for those involved in the discourse. Hear me now. The real incarnate is ultimately what's at stake in any Lacanian discourse. It ain't about agents. It ain't about others. It ain't about products. It ain't about truth. Hell, it ain't even about enjoyment. It is about the real incarnate, that which does and does not appear in the diagram in front of you. You've also heard me define discourse as the field and function of a certain social link, mediated through language use, addressivity in particular. To speak is always to speak to, and to speak to is always to link with. Everything we've been discussing about narcissistic love, phallic enjoyment, and the sexual rapport that is no such thing, to say nothing of the speaking bodies that never stop talking about this no such thing. All of this turns on the nature of the link, the social link, that we see playing out in the analytic discourse and every other discourse that has the shape like the one on your screen. For Lacan, the social link that discourse constitutes is a corporal link. It is a link established and experienced between bodies, bodies that live and die, and bodies that never shut up in the fleeting meantime between womb and tomb. That's what it amounts to. Encore galore, if you know what I'm saying, and encore in both senses, again and again and always in body. This is how we talk our way into and out of various discourses, and by extension, certain social links. Notice how Lacan recalls this aspect of his discourse theory at the start of Seminar 20. First passage to get us going, it's on page 30 of the English text that we're reading. You don't have to have it in front of you, it's just a couple sentences. As always, it would help, but I can read them for you. We must still indicate here what this link means. The link, we can but turn to this right way, is a link between those who speak. You can immediately see where we are headed. It's not just anyone who speaks, of course. It's beings. Beings we are used to qualifying as living. And it would perhaps be rather difficult to exclude the dimension of life from those who speak. What about their lives with others? Their so-called collective lives? Their conjugal lives, congregate lives, sometimes virtual lives. The list goes on. I'm talking about lives with others. Human togetherness. What about those lives? What every discourse shows, but analytic discourse also says, is that these lives, these collective, conjugal, congregate, virtual lives with others are not working out. Our social links with selves and others alike are constantly breaking down, falling apart, coming undone, which in turn tempts us with another discourse, another social link, and so on, from discourse to discourse to discourse in search of a social link that won't break. Let me be clear in all of this. Speaking beings are discursive beings, and discursive beings are beings that go round and round from one discourse to the next in search of one whose social links won't break. This isn't it. This isn't it. This isn't it, they repeat, like a record with a scratch or two in it. And ain't that the truth of discursive reality? Let's be clear, there is no other reality than discursive reality for us speaking beings. We speaking beings are discursive beings, and as discursive beings, we are broken records. It's not working out. Try this one instead. It's not working out. Try this one instead. It's not working out. Try this one instead. You want to know the difference between analytic discourse and that which props up phallic enjoyment and narcissistic love? In analytic discourse, we say it's not working out. But in the others, all we hear is, try this one instead. Now, Lacan is having fun with all of this, I think, in the opening pages of Chapter 4, particularly here on page 32 to 33. And I should correct here, 32 and 33 is actually in Lesson 3. So we're backing up just a smidge here. We're not quite into Chapter 4 yet. 32, 33, something I want to share with you. It's a longer passage, one you would be wonderful to have in front of you, but it ain't necessary. I can read it for you once more. This is why it is important for us to realize what analytic discourse is made of, and not to misrecognize the following. which no doubt has but a limited place therein, that we speak in analytic discourse about what the verb to fuck enunciates perfectly well. We speak therein of fucking, and we say that it's not working out. That is an important part of what is confided in analytic discourse, but it is worth highlighting that analytic discourse does not have exclusivity in this regard. For that is also what is expressed in what I earlier referred to as current discourse. Let us write that as, and then you see Lacan messing around with variations on French referring to a record or a disc. Really what he's talking about is a disc, a record, particularly a broken one. He says it goes around and around for nothing, quite precisely. The disc is found in the very field on the basis of which all discourses are specified and where they are drowned, where they all drown, where each and every one of them is just as capable of enunciating as much of the field as the others, but due to a concern with what I will call, for very good reasons, decency, does so, well, as little as possible. Disc, discussion, discourse, this is what he's messing with here, but the image here is one of a turntable with a broken record on top of it. What constitutes the basis of life, in effect, is that for everything having to do with the relations between men and women, what is called collectivity, is not working out. It's not working out, and the whole world talks about it. And a large part of our activity is taken up with saying so. Nevertheless, there is nothing serious, if not what is organized in another way as discourse. That includes the fact that this relationship, this sexual relationship, insofar as it's not working out, works out anyway, thanks to a certain number of conventions, prohibitions, and inhibitions that are the effect of language and can only be taken from that fabric and register. Phallic enjoyment, narcissistic love, and our respective pursuits of oneness with self and oneness with the other, these are all among the conventions Lacan is mentioning here at the top of page 33. And with them, crucial turn, and the turn that puts us into chapter 4, comes a certain world view. This is a term Lacan is messing with in chapter 4. It's one we've seen before. It's not just a worldview, though, that we see in narcissistic love and phallic enjoyment. Narcissistic love and phallic enjoyment are premised on a worldview that is, in fact, cosmological. It's a cosmology, Lacan says, that consists in the belief in a world. And by this he means a world conceived as whole, complete, and above all, one. And like any ology, add a verb, add a noun, add whatever the fuck you want in front of it, and then you've got this logy at the end. Like any logy, this one is founded on a certain logos from the Greek. And logos, as you know, means discourse in the Greek. The discourse here, the discourse that provides narcissistic lovers and phallic enjoyers with a worldview that doubles as a cosmology that figures as a universe where all is whole, complete, and above all one, the discourse here, the logos here, is that of philosophy, according to Lacan. The cosmology of narcissistic love, and beneath it, phallic enjoyment, is philosophical. Why? Because it consists in the belief that a whole, complete, and unified world exists. In other words, that this world is. that the ontos, or the Greek word for being of this world, its being is what it is. The word for talk of this sort, which I really hope has made your eyes and your ears glaze over a bit, is ontology. And once more, Lacan is on top of it. But in order to get there, we have to start with the previous lesson. Page 31. We've got some good stuff here. Ontology is what highlighted in language the use of the copula, isolating it as a signifier. To dwell on the verb to be, a verb that is not even in the complete field of the diversity of languages employed in a way we could qualify as universal, to produce it as such is a highly risky enterprise. In order to exorcise it, it might perhaps suffice to suggest that when we say about anything whatsoever that it is what it is, nothing in any way obliges us to isolate the verb to be. That is pronounced, it is what it is. And it could just as well be written, it is what it is. And here you need to see how he's actually, how Bruce is rendering this in the English. It is what it is one word spelled I-D-I-Z-W-A-D-I-D-I-Z. What an assemblage of letters. In this use of the copula, we would say nothing at all. We would see nothing at all. We would see nothing whatsoever if a discourse, the discourse of the master, and note the French here, as well as Bruce's translator's footnote, didn't emphasize the verb to be. There's a connection here that we need to suss out. The connection here is homonymic. There's a homonym between master and to be myself. In French, they sound the same. And note how everything else stacks up to this homonym between mastery and being. Phallic enjoyment promises oneness with one's self. Narcissistic love promises oneness with another. Both are founded on the belief in an existence of a world, in a cosmos, in an ontos, that is what it is, without remainder. Their worldview is cosmological, and by cosmological, Lacan means ontological. But the discourse in which all of this takes shape, allowing for the establishment, or at least the promise, of certain social links, is not philosophical, but that of the philosopher's truth, which is the discourse of the master. And that's that key turn here. So you could envision the discourse of philosophy as being aligned with that of the university, and make good headway here, because what you see in the position of truth in the discourse of the university is indeed that S1, which is the discourse of the master, the signifier of the master, the basis for the master's discourse, which of course belies its truth, barred subjectivity. But what Lacan is here doing is he's saying all this talk of being in the ontological discourse known as philosophy is propped up by a secret affinity with the discourse of the master. That's why the homonym is so important here between to be oneself, to be myself, and master. Lacan returns to this point, not surprisingly, at the start of chapter 4. It's page 39 that I want to call your attention to. I think you're going to like this. This year, I shall have to articulate what serves as the linchpin of everything that has been instituted on the basis of analytic experience. Love. People have been talking about nothing else for a long time. Need I emphasize the fact that it is at the very heart of philosophical discourse? That is precisely what should make us suspicious. Last time I had you catch a glimpse of philosophical discourse in its true light as a variation on the master's discourse. I also said that love aims at being, namely at what slips away most in language. Being that, a moment later, was going to be, or being that, due precisely to having been, gave rise to surprise. And I was also able to add that being is perhaps very close to the signifier maître, is perhaps being at the helm, and that therein lies the strangest of illusions. Terrific passage to consider, one right at the start of the chapter we're focused on here, chapter 4. So where in the discourse of the master, I ask you, do we see this strangest of illusions at work? Why, in the upper left-hand corner, of course. In the master's signifier, that S1 which says there is oneness and I am it. So if you wanted to take the model that's in front of you on the screen right now, and you wanted to add the discourse of the master atop it so that you can see what this thing actually looks like. What we're talking about now is the S1 in the position of the agent in this discourse. Orange pen here is going to equal the master's discourse. In the master's signifier, that S1 in the position of the agent in Lacan's theory of discourse, we hear a certain self-reflexive refrain. There is oneness, and I am it. Recall this discussion from our previous series on Seminar 19. Now we can add more to it. Here's what else you hear from that agent. It is what it is, and I am it. Here, in this upper left-hand corner of a semblance of agency, we see an illusion, and even I would say a delusion, of the being at which narcissistic love and phallic enjoyment both aim, namely oneness. It's not about the other for the master. It's about the one, his one, that one. He is the one. Note again the sharp distinction between this S1 of the master and that of analytic discourse, which we reviewed in our last lecture as well. In the analytic discourse, S1, as you know, is the symptom, and it always says, there are two, not one, and I'm not the one that matters here. Two truths, one unconscious and one symptomatic, and it's the former, not the latter, that calls our attention with the symptom. The S1 of the master, on the other hand, claims that there is no other, that the one is none other than themselves. It's a wholly reflexive construction. The master is the one who claims to be one with themselves and none other. In the analytic discourse, S1 is an index finger. It always points somewhere else. The symptom is an index finger that always points somewhere else, namely to the unconscious truth which commanded it. But note this, in the master's discourse, the finger in question ain't one at all, it's a thumb. In the master's discourse, S1 is a thumb which always points back to its possessor. The same way if you make a fist with your thumb sticking out and you bring it back towards your chest, you see a thumb pointed right back at yourself. This is the master's S1. It's not an index finger that points elsewhere, but a thumb that always points right back to the body that possesses it, saying, I'm the one, there is no other. What kind of oneness, then, does the master claim? You've seen it before. It's that of autonomy, self-sufficiency, independence. In short, it's that of phallic enjoyment. In fact, what I would suggest is take a look at just how easily the discourse of the master maps onto the topology of phallic enjoyment with which we began. And at this point, I'm going to give you a new image to start messing with. Now, some of you thought, well, hey, man, I can listen to this. I don't need to be here present for the viewing of this lecture. At this point, you really do probably want to be here and present for the viewing of this lecture. So recall that first diagram that we were messing with. The first diagram of the series, where you saw on the side of masculine subjectivity a cookie with a bite out of it, or some sort of a moon that hasn't quite been developed, a crescent moon of some kind. And then on the side of feminine subjectivity, you saw this other thing. It was a circle of some kind. I'm drawing it here on the screen so you can see it. And then cutting through them all on the feminine side and encompassing each and every one on the masculine side, you have this broader circle, which I label using as the phallic function here. Here's our basic image of how we get a masculine structure completely encompassed by the phallic function. There's your orange cookie with a bite out of it on the screen, next to this partially intersecting circle of femininity, where part but not all of her enjoyment appears in the field of the phallic function. And what I'm telling you here is that you can basically put the master's discourse atop this diagram. It's a very interesting and I think quite useful exercise. I'll draw it in red. Here is our master in the masculine half moon, addressing an other in the part of feminine enjoyment that intersects with the field and the function of the phallus, yielding a certain product, little a, also in the part of her enjoyment that appears in the phallic function. But as you know, don't forget, that master signifier always appears atop a truth the master cannot bear, that of barred subjectivity. And we can go ahead and add our return arrows in this discourse so it looks exactly as it's supposed to. And because we are also dedicated to holding place for something else, I add the delta of impotence raised to impossibility of the real. Here what you see is the master's discourse superimposed on the diagram of phallic enjoyment that we've already worked up. And I'm telling you, it works pretty damn well. Check it out. The master as S1 commands someone else, S2, to produce something for his enjoyment. S1 to S2 to little a back to S1. Three elements: self, other, object. Notice how I'm putting this. S1 is the self. S2 is the other, and little a is the object. For what? For exactly what you know, surplus enjoyment. You also, however, have three vectors to consider here. There's the vector of addressivity from S1 to S2, which we've discussed. There's the vector of productivity from S2 to little a, which we've also discussed. And then you've got that of enjoyment from little a back up to S1. And I've just told you the type in question here. Yes, it's occurring in the field of phallic enjoyment. More precisely, though, this is surplus enjoyment at work, exactly as we've been discussing it in lectures on Lacan. And when you look at all of these things together, there's another truth that you have to note. Everything else in feminine subjectivity is crossed out, etched out. It's not part of this discussion in these terms. So let's hit it again, hit it harder. S1 in the diagram in front of you, where the master's discourse starts popping in the field of masculinity. S1 equals the master. S1 equals the masculine subject, too. by which I mean the agent whose semblance of authority belies the very opposite. Not power, but powerlessness. Not control, but castration. Not singular authority, but barred subjectivity. And that's what you see in the position of truth. Right in the field of masculine subjectivity, there's a barred subjectivity that can't be metabolized by the one who stands up and says there is oneness. I am it. It is what it is, and that's me, motherfucker. Now, if you've got ears to hear, what I'm up to here is discussion about what it means to command from this position. From this position of a semblance of authority atop barred subjectivity, of control and power atop castration and powerlessness instead. This is why the master commands the other to produce something for them, something they hope will make up for this underlying truth of powerlessness, castration, and barred subjectivity. I'm not just talking here about the algebraic circuit, in other words, from S1 to S2 down to little a and back to S1 in the master's discourse. I'm also talking about the socio-discursive link between speaking beings that the phallic function sustains. S1 in the discourse here is the one who reduces their partner, S2, to a pile of parts, little a's, that they hope will make them feel whole, by which, of course, I mean autonomous, not reliant on others, but one with themselves, and by extension, powerful, controlling and controlled, with singular authority. Do you see how these discourses start merging together? Masculine and masterful alike. Okay, so let's ask then, what about the other side of things? What about feminine subjects in all of this? If the phallic function inclines masculine subjects toward the master's discourse, what are its effects on feminine subjects? Is there another Lacanian discourse toward which the phallic function inclines women? Yes, I would say. And it's the discourse of the hysteric. Now, bear with me on this. Don't let your knee-jerk reaction to that statement be a hindrance to letting your mind go with me a little bit on this. When I say the discourse of the hysteric is the one that tempts the feminine subject in the field of phallic enjoyment, I'm not talking about the profound clinical sense of an analysand hystericized, interrogating their symptoms in search of unconscious truths that conditioned them. Here, I'm keeping it simple. I'm thinking about the simple social operation of the hysterics discourse, which we've also discussed, notably in our series on Seminar 17, if memory serves. And I'm thinking about it directly in line with what I've been telling you about the feminine position in the phallic field. Women are taught to be what men are taught to have. It's with that mantra in mind that I proceed. You see, in the master's discourse, feminine being facilitates masculine having. This is what you see in that return vector on your screen from little a to S1. Object to ego, commodity to consumer, part of someone else to a self in search of wholeness. When feminine subjects occupy the hysterics discourse, however, their being an object of masculine desire is also what prevents the satisfaction of this desire, and much to her delight. In the discourse of the hysteric, she is what he wants, but not what he gets. And remember, we're talking about phallic enjoyment here. We're talking about the part of feminine jouissance that is governed by the phallic function. Not all of her enjoyment, as you know, is so governed. It's the part which is, once more, that concerns us here. We'll come to the part which isn't later. And once more, I think it's best if we try and diagram some of this stuff. And so let's start, much as we've done just a moment ago, by diagramming the discourse of the hysteric. This time we'll put the discourse up first because it's the one you're most familiar with. Here is your agent. Here is your other. Here is your product. Here is your truth. And of course, you see the return vectors as well. And I always can't resist, gotta add that delta of impotence raised to an impossibility here. There's just no question about it. Now let's run through this thing, this discourse of the hysteric that you now see on the screen in front of you. And if you can see it with your mind's eye far out, if you can't, try pushing pause and take a look at the video instead. It ain't me, it's the diagram that you get to see. It's worth it. From /S in the position of agent to S1 to S2 and back to /S. What do we see here? We see a lacking, desirous, feminized subject compelling a wannabe, masterful, masculinized subject to confess their ignorance of the truth which props up their semblance of authority, autonomy, and the like. Not self-mastery, but barred subjectivity. Not possession, but lack. That's what we see here. /S, barred subject, is your feminine subject compelling S1 here as a figure of the master, this wannabe masterful subject who's popping off with all these S1s to confess something, to produce an S2 in the field of knowledge here as ignorance. Ignorance of the truth atop which their claims of authority, autonomy, and the like sit. A truth which is not one of self-mastery, but instead of barred subjectivity. Not possession and plenitude, but lack and depletion. He is nothing without having her. And revealing him to be just that, a nothing without, is exactly what the hysteric enjoys. The masculinized master is nothing without having that body reduced to parts for surplus enjoyment. And the hystericized, feminized subject reveals just that about the masculinized master. He is a nothing without. And this is what she enjoys. Crucial point, which we'll come to in a second. For the masculine master, she is the part thing that allows him to feel whole, right? But check this out. For the feminine hysteric, he is the no thing whose powerlessness allows her to remain apart and thus to feel autonomous, authoritative, and commanding in her own right. This is what you see when you position the hysteric's discourse in the field of phallic enjoyment. But notice how we're going to do this thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to produce a mirror image of the discourse known as phallic that we overlay on top here of the discourse that we know as hysteric. It's a mirror image of the diagram that we've been tracing, but one that I think very closely reveals what it is we're up to here. So once more, I will put the feminine position in its own circle. Of sorts. It's a messed up circle. This circle got hit by a bus. Apologies in advance for the circle that got hit by a bus. You know what though? This is digital. Let's erase it and try again. Oh, this is such a better circle. I love this bright green circle of femininity. Now let's see if we can come up with something that'll give us a sense of that half moon of masculine subjectivity. Oh, it's a lovely blue. If you're just listening to this, you're just missing out on these terrific, just lovely diagrams. Okay, so on the left, you see that circle of feminine enjoyment. On the right, you see that half moon, that cookie with a bite out of it, of masculine enjoyment. On the left, you have the hysteric, her agency and her truth. On the right, you have the master, his agency and the truth of which he is ignorant. Now, of course, you know the next step. It is to draw the field of phallic enjoyment, which is happening for both of them. And so we take another bigger circle that goes completely around the masculine position, partially intersecting with the feminine. Now what you have in front of you is a mirror image of the diagram of the field of phallic enjoyment with which we started this series. One that allows us to capture each position. It's a mirrored image. You still have a masculine half moon meeting up with part of feminine subjectivity. So take a look at this diagram, and let's see what we can make of it. It is a mirrored reflection of our original. There is nothing new in that regard. On the left, you have the circle of feminine enjoyment. And on the right, you have that crescent moon of masculine enjoyment. Nothing really new there either. And you know about that wider circle of phallic enjoyment. It's there to show us that all masculine enjoyment is subject to the phallic function, but only part of feminine enjoyment is. With both of these discourses and all of the infused diagram work that we've been doing, master and hysteric, and then two versions, mirrored images of each other, of that of phallic enjoyment. With these elements before us, we can now ask about the unconscious truth at work in each discourse. We've heard a little bit about the masters. Let's rehearse it and then see what we can do with that of the hystericized, feminized subject. Now, in the masculinized master's discourse, it's that slashed S in the lower left-hand corner, which we just discussed. We don't need to draw it again. I think you can recall. In the field of phallic enjoyment, the truth of the masculine subject is also that of the master. Not control, but castration. Not self-sufficiency, but split subjectivity. Not singularity, but multiplicity. And because all of this is an effect of symbolic alienation, we can also say not autonomy, but heteronomy. This is what you see in the lower left-hand corner of the masculine discourse we just drew. Now, let's get on to the feminized discourse that we see in front of us now. The truth of the feminized hysterics discourse, it also occupies the same position. It's a discourse. It's in the lower left-hand quadrant. Here as object little a, object and cause of someone else's desire. In the field of phallic enjoyment, the truth of the feminine subject is also that of the hysteric, I'm telling you. The wannabe masters they compel to admit their lack are in fact symptomatic constructs of lacking subjectivities designed to guarantee her status as the omnipresent cause of their desire and ever-distant object of its satisfaction. And note, what I find so amazing about all this is that these motherfuckers say this to each other. They pronounce each other's truth right in each other's faces. If only there were ears to hear. The masculinized master's address to feminine subjects as objects of desire, partners reduced to parts for their longed-for surplus enjoyment, this speaks to the truth of the hysterics discourse. And feminized hysterics return the favor to that motherfucker, addressing masculine subjects as just that, subjects of desire. Beings of lack whose search for partners reduced to parts to help them feel whole is destined to remain a fruitless effort. So the masculinized master speaks to the feminine subject as though she were an object of desire. That is the truth of the hysterics discourse. She is an object of desire. And note, the feminized hysteric returns that favor. She doesn't speak to the master as an object of desire. She speaks to him as a subject of desire, as a desiring subject, as a barred subject, as that slashed S that is the truth that he can't handle. If only they had ears to hear this from each other. They don't. They can't hear what the other is always telling them when them two sexes get together. Masculinized masters remain ignorant of the fantasy of lack-turned-plentitude that feminized hysterics call out in them. Between his barred subjectivity in the lower left-hand quadrant and her relation to and her reduction to an object of desire, what we see is a gap. We see a break, an impasse, indeed an impossibility, just as you see it in the master's discourse, between his slashed S in the position of truth and her reduction to object little a as a cause and object for his surplus enjoyment. We don't see a connecting vector. There's a gap, a delta of impotence, indeed an impossibility. This is exactly what you see. His fantasy, and here you can think very clearly about Lacan's formula for fantasy. I wouldn't say it's a matheme, I'd say it's a formula. Slashed S, lozenge, little a, as I write it up here. Isn't this what you see in the lower half of the master's discourse? Slashed S across from little a? Yeah, but not quite, because there ain't no lozenge of relation between slashed S and object little a. His fantasy is obstructed. It never quite comes together. There is a barrier or a break in the master's discourse. He can't see the fantasy atop which his actions take place. Feminized subjects don't have it any better. They can't hear any better, as a matter of fact. They remain ignorant of the part-whole logic in which they're complicit. What the master commands her to be, she already has become in addressing him, namely an object of his desire. Between this truth, atop which she speaks, and the product of her interrogations, that S2 on the screen in front of you, the object of desire she is, there's your little a, and the subject of desire she institutes, there's your S2, there is again a gap, a break, an impasse, indeed an impossibility in the hysterics discourse and our topology alike. That's what you see here. Between the half moon of masculinized mastery and that sliver of the green circle of feminized subjectivity that shows up in the field of phallic enjoyment, there is a gap, not a connection. There's a gap. Yet another reason to read the hysteric as an attenuated variant of the pervert, as you've been hearing me do since our series on Seminar 16, off and on. The fantasy that comes together for the pervert looks something like the reverse of the fantasy the master can't understand. I write it on the board. Little a, lozenge, slashed S. Here we have some image of the pervert's fantasy. The fantasy that comes together for the pervert, and with it their imaginary function as that which gets the other off, effectively completing them, is ever forestalled in the hysteric. There's no lozenge between her little a and his barred subjectivity, represented by S2 as a figure of ignorance, the thing he can't understand. But this doesn't mean that she's free. From the desirous subject, she reveals the masculine master to be. And this is important. She may prevent his desire from being fulfilled, but she'll never be free of it. For it's the only thing which guarantees the truth atop which she sits in the field of phallic enjoyment, namely her status as object a. Make no mistake here, we wind up in a very similar conundrum at the end of this. The same dilemma that the masculinized master finds themselves in, the feminized hysteric also finds themselves in. Her autonomy, like his, bespeaks heteronomy instead. She depends on the very subject of desire that she institutes and would seek to undermine.